question 3, a 9-mark question taken from paper 2 of AS 2017 Biology. We start off with results from an investigation, and 25% of students scored 0 on this 3-mark question. Let's first take a read through and highlight some important information. Most human cells contain 2 copies of each gene. Okay, well, we know that. You get one from mum, you get one from dad, and each one of them will have a copy of a gene. We've been learning that for years, and we know that one might be dominant and one might be recessive and blah, blah, blah. Let's continue to read on. However, there might be up to 15 copies of the gene for amylase. Okay, well, that's definitely worth underlining. Scientists investigated the number of copies of the AMY1 gene in individual people in 2 populations. One population had a high starch diet and the other population had a low starch diet. Well, it doesn't take a super brain to work out that you would expect the people with a high starch diet to have more genes for amylase. Now, looking down at the question, it asks us to describe what the results show, but let's just make some general observations of the graph before we start. The big thing I notice is that beyond the number 5 on the x-axis, I can see that the low starch diet had a fewer number of copies of the gene, and that beyond the number 5, the high starch diet individuals had a higher number of the copies of the gene per person. And the second thing I notice is the range. For a high starch diet, people had either 2 or all the way to 15 copies of the gene, whereas people with a low starch diet, they also had a broad range of number of copies of the gene, going from 2 to 13, but obviously not quite as broad as the ones with the high starch diet. I can also see that the mode value, the one that occurred most often for the low starch diet, was 4, and for the high starch diet, it was 6. And I note also that contrary to what the question says about normally having just 2 copies of each gene, in this case, for this gene that codes for the enzyme amylase, it is rare to have 2 copies of the gene because most people have more than 2. So let's pause the video and see if we can summarise the information from that graph to get the marks. Well, the first thing that we noted and the first thing we're going to say is that the lower starch group had fewer copies of the gene overall, 1 mark. But then we're going to say, but their ranges overlap between 2 and 13 copies. And what we mean by that is that individuals in both groups have the same number of genes. Whether they've got a high starch diet or a low starch diet, you can get some people with the same number of genes. For the 3rd mark, we're going to point out that very few people are diploid. In other words, very few people that were investigated had just 2 copies of the gene. And then we're going to bung in there the idea that the mode for low starch was 4 and the mode for high starch was 6. And then we're going to say that the range was greater for high starch diets and smaller for low starch diets. And by saying just 3 of those 5 things, you would get your 3 marks. Remembering, of course, that 25% of students managed to score 0 for this question. So my top tip would be to learn to use terms like mode and range in your answers when tackling similar questions. Okay, the next question says that multiple copies of the AMY1 gene is an adaptation to a high starch diet. Use your knowledge of protein synthesis and enzyme action to explain the advantage of this adaptation. So we've got to explain protein synthesis and enzyme action. Well, clearly the advantage is that the more genes you've got, the more amylase you're going to get, which means you're going to digest more, which means you're going to absorb more. And all of that is correct. But let's look back to the stem of the question. It wants to know about protein synthesis and enzyme action, and there's only 3 marks. So to get the marks, we're going to say if there are more genes, there is more messenger RNA made. So more translation and enzyme is produced. So that results in a faster rate of reaction. Checking back with the stem of the question, we've talked about protein synthesis. Yes, we've talked about enzyme action, and we've explained the advantage of the adaptation. Most students who lost marks here didn't talk about protein synthesis at all. They just talked about more enzyme and faster digestion. The next and final part of the question says multiple copies of the AMY1 gene is an adaptation to a high-starch diet. Suggest how this evolved through natural selection. One of the constant gripes from exam boards is that students don't answer in the context of the question. What they do, for example, with this question is they just start banging on about what they know about natural selection. And yet the question is specific. It says suggest how this evolved through natural selection. And while everyone can explain how natural selection takes place, including GCSE students, can they explain in this context? So keeping it in context with the question, we're going to say that a random mutation produces extra copies of the AMY1 gene. Those individuals with the mutation will survive better on a high-starch diet and pass on their mutation to their offspring. And that would get us the 3 marks. We don't want to say gene or allele at this point because even individuals without the mutation will pass on the gene to the next generation. It's the idea that you've got more genes and therefore you're going to produce more enzyme. So at this point, we just check back with the stem of the question and make sure we've answered it in the correct context. I hope the video has been of use to you. Thank you for watching. Please do leave me a comment